Okay, so welcome to the third episode of Pirates of the Podcast. We're going to do a two-parter here. The first half is going to be with Chase from Hashy.so. He does some really interesting software that's really data-driven and is allowing hash makers to really dial in their freeze drying in a way that we weren't able to previously. He's always analyzing big parts of data and everything like that, and we're going to get into that. There's also a concept called absolute vac or something similar to that, and we're going to get into that and how you can use that to dial in your timing a little bit better. So, starting off, if you just want to give a brief, couple sentence long description of your product before we get into the data.
Yes, yeah, my name's Chase. Thanks for having me. Super excited to join you guys. We make digital tools for hash makers. Most of them are geared towards helping you learn from your resin, collect data on it, and then turn that data into actionable insights that you can use to save time during your process or improve the quality of your hash. And we've been focused on the freeze dryers to start. We're going to be bringing our tech to all parts of the cold room, but our main initiative right now is on harvest right freeze dryers and the Holland Green Science ones. So hopefully I can share some tips and maybe teach you guys some things about them that you didn't know before.
Okay, great. So the thing that first triggered me about your company was that you guys send live alerts to your phone. And I know so many different people that run like baby monitors and camera systems and all sorts of stuff to our harvest rungs because we're always having all sorts of problems with them. So that was the initial kind of, oh, this is a really cool thing that saves me some headaches and some knowing if my batch is running or if there's some sort of an error going on. Um, but then past that, you guys have all sorts of cool data stuff going on. And something that stuck out to me is, often when we're talking about freeze drying, I hear somebody that's giving a freeze drying talk and they're giving just kind of a blanket recipe that I like this shelf temperature in this many hours. They're not kind of giving you any variables. They're just kind of giving you a set it and forget it that this is what I do. Maybe they say if it's a little bit bigger, I extend it a little bit. If it's a little bit smaller, I shorten it a little bit. But they're just kind of giving a single recipe thing. And in my opinion, this is where we get held back a lot, is that we find somebody that's a good hash maker and we try to copy exactly what they're doing, not trying to understand the knowledge and then adapt that to our own stuff. So something that stuck out to me was you said that one of the biggest variances that you saw was between greasy and sandy type of heads and how long they took to freeze dry. Can you expand upon that a little bit?
Yeah, this is a huge one, and it's really one of the main reasons why we started all of this stuff in the first place. I haven't actually made a ton of hash myself. I had a trap delivery service, and we did make a little bit of hash, but I really quickly learned from mostly other labs that they just weren't taking a super data driven process. Most people, as you said, kind of had an SOP and would just set it and forget it. So that's really the backbone of a lot of this stuff. And yeah, we're super, intrigued by all of these different nuances, whether it's differences in the type of cuticle or what terps are present and sort of all of these different factors. And a lot of that gets lost when you just kind of recirculate SOPs or use, maybe what you saw on someone else's Instagram post. And as we know, like there's a ton of variation in hash strains and what people are watching nowadays. So yeah, the big one for us was initially like over drying. That was one of the big things that we wanted to help people avoid. And really quickly through that, we realized, people have really different definitions of what dry is. And if you have a greasy strain, it might appear different than if you have a super sandy strain. Sometimes it can be easy to mistake moisture for the strain just greasing up. So this is something that we really started to investigate a bit more deeply and try to work with a lot of our users to figure out. But yeah, the main two types of like sandy and greasy are definitely going to want different drying settings, because if you just think about the actual trichome head, the thickness of that cuticle and the composition of that cuticle is really what drives the concept of sandy versus greasy. So when you have something that's like a super delicate head, that is maybe a little bit on the greasy side, that's going to just dry very differently. Maybe compounds are coming out of the cuticle faster, lots of different factors. So we don't really have a definitive like recipe or rule that greasy strains take X amount more time, but we are definitely noticing that they want different drying settings. And so far, what kind of all of our users have reported unanimously is that the greasy strains actually take longer to dry than the sandy strains. And I think we have to dive way more into the technicalities of this to figure out if it's or to figure out what's really going on there. But it does make sense, that if a cuticle head is thinner and some of those compounds are maybe coming in and out of that membrane, that's going to get bound to water. It might behave in a very different way. So yeah, there's I think quite a bit of evidence now that suggests that they want to be dried differently. As to exactly how much more time a greasy strain wants from a sandy strain, that's what we're working to figure out next with a lot of our users.
Okay, so just if we can take a little thought process here, and let's just say we have two equal strains that both dump 4% to hash. They are both 5,000 grams of biomass, so just a nice small run. Um, and we're going to freeze dry them separately, right? We know one is basically as sandy as it gets, and the other one is basically as greasy as it can be for still hitting 4%. Can you just give a general idea of maybe the differences that you might recommend in the settings on those two different batches?
Yeah,
I know that everything is individualized, but
yeah. The
go
the
ahead.
first thing I would say is that you know if we're looking at the time as a whole, a greasy strain might want at least a few more hours. So that's something I would consider. The other thing that I'd be thinking about is shelf temps and vacuum levels. Vacuum levels we can talk about later, and it's a little bit tricky with the harvest right because you can't actually change it, and the settings are really confusing. But with shelf temp, I would say you probably want to air towards lower temps with something that's greasy. If you notice that it's greasing and you're pulling out more terps, maybe you smell it in the room, I would say lower temps probably benefit greasier strains a little bit more, with a longer and slightly more gentle drying process to get a lot of that bound moisture out at the end. And we can go into the details of the different types of moisture that are attached to the heads and how the freeze dryer influences that. With a sandy strain, I would say probably higher shelf temps are safer. But at the same time, what a lot of our users have reported is that sandy strain might have a more narrow window of perfect dryness. So let's say you're running a 18-hour cycle. Maybe the sandy strain is only perfectly dried from 15 to 16 hours, anywhere in that 1 hour window. Whereas the greasy strain might have a longer window, like anywhere from 15 to 18 hours. This is not confirmed, but just reporting what a lot of our users have seen after also looking at their charts. So I would say those are the main ones. Overall time and shelf temps. If you have a freeze dryer that has the ability to customize stages, so like a Harvest Right Scientific or a Holland Green Science, then you can even get more nuanced with how you're ramping up or down the temperature throughout that batch. And this we definitely have to do more data collection around before we have like hard figures. But I would guess that greasier strains benefit from sort of a lower temperature initially and then ramping up towards a higher temp only at the end to get that last little bit of moisture out. Whereas with a sandy strain, I think in general that same concept of ramping up applies, but it might not be as impactful, just because the heads aren't as difficult. So I'm definitely looking at shelf temp. I'm looking at time. Ideally, I'm also looking at vacuum and making that more gentle. But I think 5 to 15 degrees is a great starting point for greasy strains in the freeze dryer. I think anything that's on the sandy side, 15 to 30 is probably fine. We see a lot of guys running that and still making incredible melt. But it is going to depend a lot also on your specific freeze dryer. So uh, I don't want to introduce too many topics at once, but the concept of vacuum levels and how low that mTOR is getting will also have a really big impact on just what shelf temps even make sense for your freeze dryer.
Okay, so before we get into how vacuum levels affect shelf temp, because that's something that I've experienced pretty aggressively myself. Um, just two things I want to ask your opinion on. First is how I try to mitigate these issues for myself, because I've the reason one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you was because I saw a post that you put out, I think on LinkedIn, possibly one of the other medias, about this greasy versus sandy, and the differences. So I run a lot of pheno hunts. I run a lot of different size batches and everything like that, and generally you can get a pretty good feel for if something's going to be really greasy by the way, or sandy by the way it goes through your bags. If it's super clean and everything like that, and nothing seems to be stuck to your gloves very easily, and you just don't have sticky stuff going on, then you tend to have a sandier strain. If you start to see it greasing the bags at all, or if it's greasing the bags really heavy, it's going to be super greasy. So whenever I run to something that's greasier, what I try to do is I scoop a lot less onto the tray, and I try to spread it a lot thinner so that way I can get a faster drying time, versus if something is really sandy, I try to put a much thicker tray in if I'm going to be running them in the same batch. And I wondered your opinion on that.
Yeah, well, I'm curious. Have you anecdotally noticed that like greasier strains take longer in your dryer? Does
Oh,
that matter?
definitely. Oh, definitely. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I never noticed, I generally will run anywhere between 10 to 12 hour final dry time, depending on the batch. And I do try to manipulate the trays a little bit more, for how they dry. But my greasier stuff is never, like, it's never over dried at that point. Every now and then I find something that's sandy that's like, ooh, that could have used a little bit less time, than maybe like 10 hours or so. Some of those can be done really fast. And that's something that I only notice with really cleanly separated, really sandy heads.
Yeah, that's super interesting. To be honest with you, I've never really thought about actually just keeping everything the same and manipulating how you load your trays. That is, I think, a really good idea, especially with a harvest right where, again, you don't have that stage-based like functionality in terms of customizing the recipe. You can probably have a bigger impact on how it's drying, um, through changing the patty thickness. So that is really interesting.
Yeah.
And I know that Archive has posted, about this concept of like you want those heads to be properly suspended in water when they're on the freeze drying tray, and if they're not, then they're going to collapse in on themselves, and you're probably exposing them to unnecessary degradation. So I think what you said really is interesting, and we're gonna, I don't know, maybe we'll start like doing some experiments with that. But that's I think a pretty good idea. Generally a thinner patty is going to dry faster, and you're going to have a more even top to bottom dry. At the
Yep.
same time, if you're too thin, we have seen where the edges can start to crisp up a little bit before like the center of the patty. So I think as long as you're filling the tray close to uniform, manipulating that thickness is probably a good idea. If it's too thin and too small of a patty or blob, I would just be a little cautious with over drying, because sometimes those corners and edges can dry a little bit faster. And as we see patties get thicker, typically we see like a as with anything in hash, like there's a sweet spot where you get nice and even drying. The edges aren't drying first, but also then you get uniform top to bottom. If you go too thick of a patty, you can definitely see where the bottom dries faster than the top. So probably a sweet spot, but I think that's a really interesting idea, actually.
Yeah.
I would think it's
So
pretty good.
people can understand conceptually what I'm talking about. Say you have a Harvest Right 7 tray medium, and you're running 2 batches out of a mini osprey, so like 6,000 grams or something like that. The I might put the really sandy stuff over 2 to 2.5 of those trays, and then the really greasy stuff would go over 3.5 to 4 of those trays, depending on the ratio. But yeah, so I would try to have maybe half as much per tray.
Yeah, that is pretty smart. We've actually never done content on that or like done a deep dive, honestly. We mostly just tell people to go for like a nice wet slurry and like that's pretty much the extent of it. But I think actually that would be really interesting. And on that, we recommend to people always to track the wet weights going into the freeze dryer and the dry weights coming out. And no, it's not a perfect science. And like ideally, you're using also moisture meters and water activity, all of that fancy stuff. But I mean, it doesn't make sense for a lot of people's workflows. So,
Right.
as far as we can get is where we want to go. And I think weights are doing maybe 75% of the value of a lot of those other indicators. So for that, we've heard a lot of users say that even just tracking wet weights has helped dial in a lot of consistency in terms of how they load their trays, even across different washers. So I wonder if through that we could get to a point where, if we're going for a greasier strain, we could say like aim for this, about this level of wetness based off of your other batches and this level of moisture removal. I didn't really think about using it to actually guide the scooping of the trays, but I think that's like a very natural thing that we should also try to help with.
Cool. Um, and so, real quick before we move on to how vacuum affects temperatures, um, when scooping trays, I know sometimes when we're getting really analytical about this stuff, the idea is to make it as analytical as you can and to make everything as even as you can. And the only way to kind of make your scoops as even as you can is to remove all of the moisture that you possibly can. But then, if you do that, we also find the issue of you're having big clumps on your trays. So most of us really like that kind of pancake batter, thick milkshake type consistency, and we just try to go as consistent as we possibly can on that. Just wanted your general thoughts on most of us trying to do that kind of thick pancake batter milkshake consistency.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And then also, it seems like there's a fair amount of evidence out there that supports going into the freeze dryer with like some level of moisture. I know that outside of hash, there's a lot of research done on freeze drying, and we've looked at some of that stuff. And then within hash, Whistler has a really good piece of content on freeze drying, where they go super into the weeds with a lot of this. But I think you do want a pancake battery, slightly wet consistency. I know there are people who make incredible melt that are wicking a lot of the moisture away. Cuban comes to mind, Sensei Solventless comes to mind, and they make great melt. So I don't know that there's a wrong answer. I think it comes down to what product you're trying to make. I also, just
Right. Hold on, real quick. Just let
anecdotally,
me specify for anyone listening that is not a hash maker themselves. So Cuban Tech and a few of the others that are wicking as much as they possibly can. Those guys are generally air drying, or they're doing the vac dry in the cold room, where they're using a vacuum oven in a cold room and kind of freezing and then microplaning or doing some sort of a sift technique onto parchment trays. And then drying it that way. So they're generally trying to wick as much as they can, but they're not using the freeze dryer. Just wanted to add that.
Yeah, they're definitely trying to replicate that air drying consistency, and I've seen different techs. I know a lot of people are doing and trying to mess with this. Humphrey has his own method; those guys have their own method. Schwale
That's
has his own method also, which is something we can even talk about in here, which I think is interesting. But a
That's
long
true.
way.
Real quick. I should have mentioned that as well. That some people do actually prep their freeze drying trays like that to do some sort of really quick freeze drying method, and they have some fun little names for it because sometimes it'll come out a little looking a little bit air dried almost. Um, so yeah, so I was not completely 100% when I said that's all for air dried because some people will prep for a freeze dryer like that. But as a generality, most of us are doing the pancake batter. But go ahead. You were talking about some stuff that Schwale does.
Yes, yeah, and Schwale also has method, which is replicating that type of final consistency, but is more of a normal freeze drying process where he's not wicking away any of that moisture. So here's what I think. I think you can make a great product if you're wicking away moisture. If I was running hash every day, 24/7, I wouldn't do it though. I think that you are at risk of pulling out more terps and kind of like abusing the heads than if you do like a nice wet patty. I think the water gives you room for error, basically. And I also think that we may find out that it may mitigate some of the off gassing of volatiles and stuff as well. I'm not really sure yet, but I think you get more wiggle room with wet trays. And I absolutely see people making competition winning melt also with wet trays. So I don't
Yeah.
think you have to wick away moisture to do that. I think it's just one technique that people do. I would be cautious of it though, because from just some little R&D that I've done with, lab and a close friend here in LA, we tried the same strain and same run dried different ways, like normal freeze drying, speed drying, and the stuff that was wicked and quote unquote speed dried was just like far worse and unpleasant to smoke than the stuff that was freeze dried normally and then partially cured using the Schwale method. And that still resulted in like a pseudo air dried, a little bit different consistency. So I just think it depends on what your goals are, but I lean towards wet trays. I'm slightly skeptical of like the full mesh trays. I haven't seen, unfortunately, like anybody say anything positive about them ever. I wish that I could say it again.
I think I think part of that is that company advertises all their stuff so horribly. I saw some videos that they put out that have since been taken down that was just like draping 25U all over tables, and it could add so much contaminant and so much crazy shit. Um I think that there is some sort of a value possibly to allowing some maybe heat transfer or some sort of moisture wicking through the bottom or something like that of those the trays that are mesh if we're talking about the same thing. But as well as I just haven't seen anybody mess with them or do anything or seen anything positive, and I think that's part of how they were presented by the company.
I will say, out of the three people that I know that have used them and compared head to head with regular trays, they all said the exact same thing, which again could just be chance and maybe their recipe is not optimized, but they all said that it just over dried the shit out of their hash. Like impossible to avoid no matter what they would do. It was just too fast, basically. And like the edges were drying faster than the interior. So I don't really know. I mean, like, truth be told, my co-founder is the one that understands a lot of the nuances of the freeze drying process more than me. That's where his background is, but I don't think there's a lot of evidence that suggests actually that having it come out the top and bottom is best. I think those trays and machines were optimized for heating in a very specific way, transferring through the tray into the product. And if you're messing with that, I would just be super cautious, I guess, and skeptical. Like, I think if that was the best way to do it, then we'd see a lot of freeze dryer companies putting out sintered mesh trays.
Yeah,
But they're not, you know. I could be wrong though. So we'll
right. I
need
would
a bit
I
more.
would like I would love to do a lot of R&D with those and just see for myself. It's just not something that I have material to waste on currently that I feel like doing or anything else.
We offered to supply a free Hashy link to someone who wanted to compare sintered versus regular trays, like trying with that company, and they declined. They were like, "We don't need data on it. We have data on it. It's better." So there you have it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm personally blocked from their account because they were doing something really terrible and telling hash makers to do that, and I pointed that out, and a bunch of people agreed with me, and they didn't like that. So yeah, I'm blocked from their stuff. But
No
uh
sintered trays for you.
yeah, no center trace for me. Just out of curiosity, do you happen to know if the three people that tried it, if they dried it on the 25U mesh or if they dried it on parchment?
No, this was on the like metal sintered trays, just with the
Right
wet.
on the trays.
I think so, yeah. Or maybe
Because
no, maybe I don't honestly know what they tell you to do, but it was whatever the supplied SOP is.
the SOP is that you're doing a 25U mesh sheet and you're like wrapping it over top. It's so fucking weird and I don't like it at all.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
it's. I saw a lot of people. You know, there was interest in, and this was interesting to us too. The suspending the heads in water before you dump onto the tray to get like a super even homogenized mixture. Like, I think that
mhm.
would be good tech, and I see a lot of people doing that and getting much more even drying because then literally every single tray can have the same ratio of head to water. So I think that's interesting tech, but then also I don't remember who posted, maybe hashtag or maybe someone else was posting like they did that and found that it wasn't good for super terpy strains because it kind of like exposed them to more degradation. I don't remember exactly. I have to look at it again, but that to me is the most interesting part of that whole sintered mesh tray development is actually just the dumping the heads into a mason jar of water first and like homogenizing that way. I think that's understudied. Like that might be an interesting way to go about stuff, especially if you're a larger scale person and you have maybe some employees doing washing. Like I think that could
Right.
be
So
interesting.
I believe Dirty Arm Farm does that.
Yes,
He
that's right.
yes, yep. So he does giant batches, and that really makes me wonder. Uh, they have kind of a funny collection vessel thing. I believe it's like the flat bottomed. Um, whatever. I could be wrong on that, so maybe I shouldn't be speaking out of turn. But either way, if you're running a 200-gallon washer or a 120-gallon washer or whatever their system is, that's fucking massive, and you're dumping out, these like they line up like 30 trays at a time, and to do one dump of all of these heads. I just wonder like how much hash can you run through the bags um, and have it come out and not get clogged up. And it seems like you're dumping a lot through there. So I feel like for sandy stuff, it could definitely work. For greasy stuff, it seems like it could be fucking worse.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. There's a lot of potential benefits and drawbacks, but I think that's another thing that we should explore if we're looking into the like scooping next. That's naturally something we should also look at.
Yep. And you do have at that point you're combining washes. So, if you are on the understanding that your best heads are your ones that fall off easiest, that are going to be your first and second wash, You may not want to combine everything, just if you're breaking your stuff down into quality. But if you're just putting out all of your 73 through 139 or whatever your peak tier of collection is, and then all of your food grade would be anything above and below that, and you're just homogenizing all of those together, and you have an A and a B grade, then that's not a bad idea at all as long as it's working within your collection setup. So,
Yeah,
um,
or even like, and I know this is like the minority, but there are definitely some guys that are in our user base and outside of it that are filling freeze dryers with like one pole potentially. So I
yeah.
do think um, you could apply that and then even do strain specific or micron specific, but it just depends on scale, and like the best thing is the thing that takes you to the highest quality of hash without you having to change your process a shit ton. And to me, that's just like, yeah, have a wet scoop, a milkshakey style scoop, like if you're aiming for that as a baseline, I think you're setting yourself up to be able to do lots of different recipes in the freeze dryer or drying techniques after. So just to like recap that, I would say you're right on the milkshakey consistency, and like maybe in the next couple of years we find something else is better. But for now, I think that's perfect to aim for.
Okay, so let's move on to how affects shelf temp, and we'll give a little anecdotal story about my own stuff. So, a reason why I came into the freeze drying space a little bit more, and my thoughts became a little bit more prevalent out in the community, is I was one of the first people, if any, to push for flush mounted freeze dryers into your cold room. To me, that just allows you to open up into the cold. You're not having to deal with as much condensation and everything like that, and you're keeping the heat out. Um, it makes it much better for processing. The issue that you get is if you're flush mounting your freeze dryer, you may be running into a space on the other side of that wall where it doesn't have as much airflow. Um, and you're not keeping it as cold, and so you're going to notice possibly small or possibly large changes in what your vacuum pump is pulling for your machine, and that definitely affects drying times, and that definitely affects shelf temps from what I've found just with my own stuff. Because if I'm keeping everything a fan on and everything super cold, my uh my vac pump will get 200 mTOR or lower, and when it's really hot, I've had it be up like over 400, close to 500, and it acts differently. So if you could talk a little bit about the little bit more in-depth and technical side of that, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, the first thing I would say just on flush mounting is like super interesting. We have seen some guys running freeze dryers in the cold room if it's a big enough cold room and having good results. And like you said, if you're opening up into room temp, you are always going to have some issues with condensation. We don't know how big of an impact it is yet. If it's like instantly returning it back to moisture saturated, but also something we want to look into. I would just say be a little careful of what you're like plumbing it into, because if it is too closed off in air, you just don't want the freeze dryer getting above like 85 degrees. Like if the condenser is reading the room temp sensor is reading like 85, you may be instantly voiding your warranty, and also you're definitely losing efficiency as it gets hotter. But the interesting thing that you said is that the vacuum pump was running a little bit more gentle when it was hotter, which is potentially a good thing. So yeah, I think that's an interesting tactic too, and like people can mess with, but just be a little bit cautious about the airflow. Definitely try to like plumb it out so that it has room around the freeze dryer. And then, yeah, the main parts of vacuum are pretty simple. The mTOR is going to have a huge impact on what your boiling points are of all of those volatile compounds in the hash. And it also has a big impact on how fast the batch dries. So those are the main things, and if you understand those concepts, then you already understand more than most hash makers. So I would say, like, look at the mTOR number, and that low point that it gets to, you might see it get to 200, you might see it get to 100, depends on how new the freeze dryer is, what software it's running, pump, all of this stuff. That is going to dictate your sort of potential for saving terps. And what I mean by that is, if you take a mTOR that is 200 versus an mTOR of 500, the 200 mTOR is going to lower the boiling points of those terpenes and other volatiles more. We know that it's not a perfect, like, one-to-one of you hit that vacuum and you're instantly boiling off, because there is a membrane, there is a cuticle, and inside of the head there's some matrix which has, maybe its own pressure and some of this stuff. But we know that in general, the lower your vacuum goes, the lower of a pressure you have, the lower those boiling points are. So probably want to avoid that. Again, like, maybe we find out in a couple years that it's different. But the current logic now is those vacuum levels have a massive impact on what terps you're boiling off. We see people who are running Holland Green Sciences, for example, go drastically up in terp retention. And I think one of the main reasons for that is vacuum control. And that's like a whole sub niche of this vacuum stuff that we can get into. But if you look at those, you can see terp percentages increasing typically. And I think a lot of that is that, the mTOR on a harvest rate goes very low, sometimes sub, 80 on a new freeze dryer with the newest firmware. Whereas a lot of people running like a Holland Green Science, for example, are more in the 400, 500 mTOR range. So going to have a big impact on which terps are boiling. It also ties into the whole shelf temp thing, because a lot of people talk about the benefits of running super low shelf temps. And generally, again, like, we agree, you want to run low shelf temps, put as little heat into the hash as possible. But at the same time, your vacuum level will have a major impact on how effective those shelf temps are. So running 5-degree shelf temp versus 30-degree shelf temp at 100 mTOR, you're going to notice much less of a difference in terpene preservation versus if you're at a higher mTOR of 500 and you're running 5-degree versus 30-degree. A 5-degree shelf temp at 500 mTOR has much more terpene preservation potential, because the boiling points are nice and high and you're not applying a lot of heat into the hash. But as soon as that mTOR starts dropping, again, those boiling points are coming down with it. So that's kind of it in a nutshell with boiling points. And then all of that also is going to have an impact on how much time it needs. The common logic is that pulling a deeper vacuum just increases your batch speeds. But I think, as I'm going to keep saying all the time, is like, it's probably, there's a Goldilocks zone, and it's not, it's not as simple as just like go as low as you can one direction. I think there's going to be a sweet spot where you have the fastest drying, but going too high in mTOR, too much pressure, too gentle of a vac, that's definitely going to decrease your speeds. People have reported that all the time. But I also think that going too low could be suboptimal as well. So I would also just pay attention to, like, how long a batch takes at that different mTOR. So, and you can do this without our device, to be super clear. Like, you can literally just look at your freeze dryer and do this on the fly. You can pull your logs off the freeze dryer also and do it that way. But what I would look for is One of the most important numbers is like, what is the lowest mTOR it gets to? And if you understand that, then, of course, there's a ton of variables and variation, but for the most part, that's going to give you a good baseline to go off of for seeing how long stuff takes. Also, just seeing what kind of terp preservation realm you're in. So I would definitely look at that, and then at a really high level, just kind of start to see how long batches take and how long it's going when you're checking, before you're checking, and you might find that, oh, when my freeze dryer gets down to this mTOR, it's a lot faster, or when it sits here, the terps come out better. So that's kind of the main you know vacuum in a nutshell. And then we have like this slightly more advanced technique, but it's pretty simple, of like what we call just using ultimate vacuum to time your drying. And I can go more into that, but yeah, that's like all aspects of vacuum, time and terpene preservation, really.
Okay, cool. So, I want to give a note on that and then give you a thought experiment. So, my note would be that, again, with the freeze dryers, if you're in a little bit tighter of a space, or if you've done the thing where you're flush mounting them in, something that I've noticed that's helpful is you want to have some sort of airflow. I use fans. I have one pointed at the condenser. I make sure that I'm blowing cool air towards the condenser, the right side of the freeze dryer, if you're looking at it from the back, I believe, on the harvest rights. And then the vacuum pump itself, I try to put a really strong fan on that, and I try to blow it in the direction of where I'm exhausting the heat. Definitely not in the direction of the freeze dryer. Both of those seem to make the process more effective.
Yeah,
So
that's
that would
great suggestions.
be my note, and then my thought experiment would be, so two different trains of thought here. I believe Humphrey was more into the I would like a 5 degree shelf temp, as well as I believe he was always trying to manipulate the vacuum pumps to get a little bit higher of an mTOR, up around that 500 number, and that can take a very long time to dry. But as you were saying, that can also provide some great terp retention. And then previously, this is a couple years back, so his thoughts may have changed then. But when I was talking to Colin, Vessel Life, his idea was they were using a little bit heavier duty freeze dryers. I'm not quite sure what brand, and he wanted to pull a much higher vac. He wanted to do a little bit higher of a shelf temp, and his idea was that the shortest time under vacuum that they could get dry heads was the best for terp preservation, or just quality of end product. Um, I also agree that there would be a Goldilocks zone, but just kind of your thoughts on the two extremes, um, and just if you would prefer one or the other.
Yeah, it's a great question. I love and respect both of those guys and everything that they've done for hash and freeze drying in general. Humphrey definitely puts out a lot of great knowledge, and I personally talk with Colin quite frequently. So both great guys. I think it illustrates also this point of like everything in hash, though, which is you have two guys that are making amazing hash, and they're doing it totally different ways. And I just don't think there's a wrong answer. It could be one of those things where, you know, down the road we discover that one is significantly better than the other. But right now, I think that's kind of the perfect example of like our philosophy on all of this, which is I really don't know what's best. We just want to make the tools that help all of you guys figure out uh, what's best, between those two extremes, and maybe you land somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. But I don't know. The issue for me is that I see both of those methods making really amazing melts. So I think it depends a lot on what strains you're running. I think it depends on what you like as an end product, and sort of like what you define as, dry. And I think it depends on, probably a lot to do with what equipment you're running, because again, with the harvest rate, like you're just limited in what variables you can control. So I could see how like gentle is better in general. Whereas with the other ones, you can get a little bit more precise with those stages. So maybe there is some logic to having precise control of that, and the exact time at different temperatures. But yeah, I don't know. I certainly hope that we can help people figure it out, but I think a lot of this stuff is going to come down to personal taste, like what you want to put out as an artist, and what your region likes and what your resin likes and all of this stuff. So I don't know if there's a best between them. I think it's just another thing that is probably a spectrum. And yeah, like just also on everything I say, like we certainly don't know what's best. We have worked with a lot of people and we try to collect as much data as we can, and it's always changing. But with pretty much everything, I think it applies. Like it's a spectrum, and a lot of it is just going to come down to what you're trying to put out.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. And that's something that, seasoned veteran hash makers, especially guys that hunt a lot, will understand a lot more. Your newer guys, or your guys that are running factories, or your guys that are running, these really well known super sandy cuts, and nothing else, they may not see that as much. But, like myself, I run a ton of breeding programs. I run a ton of hunts. I run a ton of different size washes. And I also have kind of a seasonal setup where I use a lot of different airflow and everything like that. So my temperatures and my humidities and everything like that, even as well as in my cold room, are very different throughout the year. So I have to manipulate all of my settings and the way I do everything constantly throughout the year for these variances, and it's given me a great understanding, versus just kind of this is my lab. It's 32 degrees every day, and 10% relative humidity, and my freeze dryer works at the exact same mTOR every time, and this and that. So that is something that we need to understand, is how all these different variables work together and how we need to work them. Let's see. Then just one more thing possibly two more things before we get into the ultimate vac, and then about how we use your software to understand all this stuff better. Is being able to tell when your stuff is dry is something that you brought up, and that is something that I have been running into from time to time. Every now and then I do these runs where I call them contest prep runs. I keep it really cold at night. I don't let the temperature get too high during the day. I keep the humidity a little bit higher. I do a bunch of things that, in my experience, in my personal setup, have led to greasier, higher terp runs. And within that, some of those are already a little bit unstable and everything like that, and kind of hard to work with. I don't know if anyone has ever run the actual Mac 1 cut, and tried to hash that. That can be some of the greasiest, most nightmare stuff. It'll stick right to your gloves. It'll stick to the cards. You can't sift it, anything like that. So when you get something that's super greasy like that, and you're pretty sure it's dry because there's no hard parts to it, but you can't chop it with a knife to see if it separates easy. You can't run it through a sift. You can't do any kind of the normal things that you would do to see if that is dry, other than make sure that there aren't hard frozen parts. Are there any things that you can kind of think of to determine if something is dry when it's really greasy and you can't really touch it, but you
Yeah,
ran it through a freeze dryer?
really good question. Um, Getting hands on with it, looking at it, doing a sieve test, smoking it. Those are all, I think, the best ways to determine dryness. And maybe using moisture tests and water activity, but I've heard a lot of makers report that it's just like way too much variability test to test to get any sort of valuable data from that. But maybe we're just using the wrong models. So I think those are like all super important ones. At the same time, just also understanding like how much time you've been drying for and comparing that against when you check it. and how dry the hash is, I think is also super important. So like there's never a replacement for getting hands on with it and really making sure it's how you want. But I would say leverage the data then to sort of augment that and like confirm some of your beliefs or like confirm your recipe. Um, we do that by using this ultimate vacuum technique where um, you know I mentioned the kind of mTOR low point before. Ultimate vacuum is really just measuring the time you're at that low point and using that to inform sort of your decision of when to check stuff, whether or not it might be in the realm of being dry. So I think combining all of those together is like the best way to determine whether or not your hash is dry. I don't think there's a one best method, but for super greasy stuff that is harder to get hands on with, I think using Ultimate Vacuum might be even more important and valuable because you can maybe eliminate a check, which is going to open the door, add more condensation. Then you're going to have to pull back down again to vac. And, just from a time standpoint, super suboptimal. From a resin standpoint, we don't know, might be suboptimal. So using Ultimate Vacuum might be an even more powerful indicator for those. Um, and
So to just give you a basic idea, so like the worst of the worst of what I'm talking about would be there's certain things that if I'm doing a contest prep run, I can only wash these during the winter when my cold room will be max of 38 degrees. And at that 38 degrees, I'm still when I'm pulling everything out, I have to run I bought a kind of oversized desiccant DHU. I run that aggressively for a couple hours. And then I shut it off about a half hour before I go to pull the trays, just so I can make sure it's extra dry, and then I use that extra half hour to get the temp down as low as it'll go. And when I'm pulling out, what happens is, I can't touch it with a card, I can't touch it with my gloves, I can't touch it with anything. The only thing that I can touch it with is literally parchment. So I will take a card and just know that I'm going to grease it up, and I will kind of play around a little bit with it and make sure um, that I'm not seeing any sort of hard or frozen spots in the places where I would suspect them to be. As a generality, I'm also going a little bit longer with my time. I want to, I want to really make sure that it's dry. And I find with the greasier stuff, it doesn't dry out as fast. So you can give it a couple extra hours and just kind of be extra sure. And even then, so if I've gone, like, say I've gone 4 or even 6 extra hours and it's still just this greasy, can't touch it at all, to me, it's dry. But I'll have to literally fold the parchment on top of itself into cubes and then cut the parchment with scissors, and try to pull that back. And then I'll take a bag and cut it open, and I'll wrap the outside of that and then pull the parchment off and wrap the bag around the other side of that. So that way I can take what's essentially a bagged patty and then put that inside of other bags and double bag them. And that's the only way that I can handle that and get that onto the rosin press. Um, so it can make something like that really tough to know if it's fucking dry or not.
yeah. Yeah, I would say like you should experiment with looking at the time at Ultimate Vacuum and using that to give you some window of, like, oh, based on past runs I've done of similar material, I want to end up
So
at that amount of time.
So let's really define ultimate vac. It sounds like if you're taking the data set and looking at all of the vacuum points going from start to finish, you're talking about when it's achieving the lowest mTOR number on that chart, and holding it for a period of time or something like that.
Exactly, yeah. So if you imagine looking at your harvest right screen, it will drop and drop and drop, and the numbers will keep getting lower. And then usually it will reach a point where it doesn't get lower anymore, or maybe it's only fluctuating by 1 or 2 mTOR. And that is typically when you're at ultimate vacuum. So what that looks like on a graph is basically, if you plot out all of the vacuum, like you said, it's just like a curve that drops and drops, and then it starts to flatten out at the bottom of that curve. And what you're measuring by doing ultimate vacuum is just sort of the time spent at that flat point at the bottom of the curve. If you're looking at the screen, it's the time spent once the mTOR stops changing so much. Um, and I think context, like, why do that over overall cycle time? Well, the ultimate vacuum and the fluctuation of it is actually how the harvest right and many comparable freeze dryers detect dryness. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for that stability. When it reaches a certain stability level, it's dry. So we know that this is, like a pretty widely accepted method. And also, if you look outside of hash and cannabis, like, lots of industries are using ultimate vacuum for this purpose. So
So
um,
real quick, so I understand it coming down in temperature, but then we're also adding in the time element. So are you looking at, like, is there a difference, say, like run to run? Say, will ultimate vacuum happen over, and I'm just going to throw out a number here. I'm sure it could be completely off, but say our first ultimate vacuum, we're showing a curvature of it staying at the dip for 40 minutes. Is there going to be another one that's 20 minutes, another one that's maybe 50 minutes? And how is that affecting our drying time?
yeah, so the sort of like steepness of the curve is usually tied to how much material you have in there. So, like, I think it also might be helpful to break down the different stages of drying just with the harvest right to give context. So, first, you're freezing. A lot of people pre-freeze their trays. Some people don't. Either way, you're freezing. There's no vacuum being applied, so it's like, atmospheric pressure. Everything's freezing, and then the harvest right goes into vacuum freezing, which is, as it sounds, still freezing, but just pulling down a vacuum, and it's getting ready to start drying. And then on the harvest right, it doesn't really tell you. It just goes into drying, but there's actually two phases of drying that happen. So right after it goes into vacuum freezing, you're in primary drying, which is where the curve is still going down. So the mTOR is still getting lower, but you're doing the bulk of your moisture removal. So I like to think of it, it's probably an oversimplification, but as an 80-20 rule. During primary drying, which is only like 20% of the time, you're removing 80% of the moisture. And then when it progresses later into drying, it enters into what's called secondary drying. And that's where you're removing just the last couple percentage of moisture, but it's bound to the heads, to the molecules, so it's a bit harder to remove. Again, the harvest rate doesn't really break that down. I think in some models and firmware versions in the logs, they might actually, but that's important context. So when you're in primary drying, which is again where the majority of the water is being removed from the hash, that mTOR is still dropping down. Once it gets through that is when you're starting to approach ultimate vacuum, and that's what we're using then to measure sort of like these times. And there's definitely variation from different batch sizes of where it's going to get to. There's definitely going to be variation on greasy versus sandy, like we talked about. But for the most part, it's a pretty good rule of thumb just based off of what a lot of our users have reported, as far as like a general indicator. It might need to sit there for 2 hours for them for their batch size. And so they know every time it gets there, they just kind of wait for it for 2 hours, and then it's dry. Other people, running much larger batches may find that it needs to sit there a lot longer. But the common point I would say is you are maybe avoiding a couple unnecessary checks. That's always our first goal with working with people typically, and with using ultimate vacuum, just to illustrate value. Is like, if you are checking the hash 3 times, putting it back in, you're adding time. You might be messing with quality. We're not really sure yet. But using Ultimate Vacuum, you might look at all of those patterns and see, oh, I'm always checking it, 2 hours early. I can just let it go an extra 2 hours. So it's just a little bit more precise way of looking at batch times. That's really how I like to think about it, compared to the overall time of the harvest right, which has a lot of variation. It's a way to account for a little bit of that difference in maybe your scooping, or different cultivar specific ones, where it gives you that good baseline of like, here's the general time I'm adding or going for, give or take a few. And I think a good example of that is like, if you have a 20-hour batch, for the same strain, you might even still just have variation from the harvest right, maybe how you scooped, going into that. So on one of those, if it doesn't reach ultimate vacuum until hour 12, it might not be dry at the end of that 20 hours. Whereas if the other one reaches ultimate vacuum in 3 hours, then it might be super dry by the end of that. So I think that's sort of the main point of ultimate vacuum, is like you can use it to even out some of the variability with the harvest right, so you get a little bit more control over exactly when you want to pull your hash, and you're not just relying on the harvest right, like auto computer to decide when it's dry. Because keep in mind, their algorithm, like what it's good for is it's optimized for tons of different stuff, food, candy, all these different things, which inevitably are going to want to be dried slightly differently. And understanding ultimate vacuum just lets you sort of manual override their control and decide when you want to pull it specifically.
Okay, so I have a little thought thing I want to go through with you about possibly some of the other freeze dryers. Let's keep it on the ultimate vac and the harvest right for right now. Um, so if people don't know this, you can plug in a blank USB to your harvest right after you do a run. It'll write the log data onto there, and it gives you just kind of like a grid chart where it just has numbers on there. So your software is something that provides more data, and rather than just kind of numbers where you would have to graph stuff yourself and everything, and this is just from my understanding, I'm gonna have you expand upon this, but you're giving live graphing, not after the end. So you couldn't do ultimate vac with the just plugging something in after your run. You need to have this sort of live software. So if you could just talk a little bit more about how your software really helps to dial in ultimate vac and a few of the other things that you may be looking at as far as the live data and what that may be telling us about our runs and how to make them the most efficient and best hash they can be.
Yeah, I would just say first though that you can definitely use Ultimate Vacuum without our device, and like it might just be a little bit harder, but I would definitely encourage everyone to try it, even just by looking at the screen and like literally starting a stopwatch on their phone. I think that's a great way to start experimenting with it. The two ways you can do that are look at the screen in a batch, see when it gets to the low point, and then just start the timer. Or if you want to get a little bit more precise, do what you just said, pull your logs off onto your computer, look for what the low point of that number is. And then when you run a batch in the future, you can start it once it gets to that low point, and then you just click your stopwatch. So
Right.
definitely.
So for both of those, right, for the first scenario that you talked about, you'd have to actively be standing in front of your machine and monitoring yourself versus being able to see that on your phone. And for the second one, you won't be able to get the small minutia that changes batch to batch, where you were talking about how the things can ramp a little bit differently, and show you that possibly you had a little bit more or less water in your hash than you thought that you did.
Yeah, it's not going to be as precise. It's definitely going to be more of a pain in the ass too, because you're going to have to at least be in front of there once it gets, to the low point. We do have a guide on our website actually that walks you through how to do it manually, just with a stopwatch. It's like a super detailed guide that we did with a guy called Hash Crew, and he was one of the first people that was really talking about this concept of ultimate vacuum. So um, I would say check that out. Like you're right, it's definitely a little less precise. Being able to do it from your phone is nice, and it makes it easier because we have a graph that literally just like plots out the curve. Whereas if you do it with the logs, you would have to either graph it yourself, or now also we have a log analyzer. So even if you don't have a Hashy link, you can just plug your logs into our analyzer and get a lot of the same charts. But seeing it live is definitely making it easier. And yeah, you pretty much hit the nail on the head. Like we're pulling in all of the sensor data, very similar to the data points that you'd get from a log. We're just making it really easy to look at with nice visuals and charts. We're sending it live, and we're letting you sort of interact with that data however you want in real time. The harvest rate stuff is a little bit limited in terms of what it'll show you on the screen, or even now on their newest freeze dryers with their app, where we're super focused on like just giving you hash specific data that's valuable, from the resin's standpoint. So it comes in
And you,
live, comes in on any device, and then it also stores all of the logs and history ongoing, so that you can just go back and quickly look at any of your batches.
and for someone like myself, like I do absolutely everything myself. Usually I'm trying to get at least 2 batches in, sometimes 3, sometimes even more, depending on the space that I have in the freeze dryer and the size of the batches. So by the time I'm starting my freeze dryer, hopefully I have everything in the lab clean, because all of us as hash makers have learned the horrible lesson of what happens if we don't clean our lab until the following day. Um, so, we're usually just freaking beat. Like there's nothing else we want to do other than go rip a giant dab, as long as our lungs are still cool with that, and relax, and not have to go back into the freeze drying room and everything like that. Um, so yeah, so that does, it sounds much nicer to be on a phone. Um, the Holland Green Sciences, right? I'd like to talk a little bit about those. You talked that they have more ways to manipulate and do things with them, and more variability. Are you able to manipulate the mTOR, or the vacuum on them?
Yes, that's one of the key differences from the harvest right, is that it has a bleed valve on it, and it's like, built into the system. So it makes it super easy to change what vacuum you're hitting and completely customize it based off of that. So that's, I would say,
Okay.
like, in addition to it being better built, that's the key feature difference right there.
Yeah, whenever I've talked to the Holland Science Green Science guys, I've been impressed, and their machines just seem really impressive. I really like what they're doing. And anybody that I've talked to that has ran one of their machines has had nothing but good things to say about it. Also to mention, there's a couple machines that you can't do any of this on yet. Hopefully in the future, but there's like the Alpine Blue. There's the Fresh something. I
Yeah.
can't even think of the other one.
Yep.
But and there's a Canadian company as well, that I believe they're putting out a pretty good market, and probably gonna move it down here. I don't know if it's available down here at all. I forget the name of that one as well. But all just kind of harvest rate competitors, and everything. And then the next step up used to be like a $30,000 machine, which people would say had a lot of issues, and now it's the Holland Green Science, which isn't that much more expensive than Harvest Rate, but seems a hell of a lot better. um, so the thought experiment that I wanted to go through with being able to manipulate the mTOR on that is possibly, what would you think about the opposite, when it comes to greasy strains versus sandy strains of the ramp, where you want to keep it very delicate, to draw the moisture out without drawing out too many of the terps from the greasy stuff, and then kind of ramp it up right at the end to try to pull out any moisture that you can, but not try to pull out those volatiles. and because they do have kind of like a soft line of being done. That's why I tend to run my greasy stuff extra long or do it extra thin. uh so, and then if you're going to something sandy, where those are the only times where I have felt like I've personally over dried stuff outside of equipment malfunction, um has been when it's been a really sandy head and it was in there with other stuff that had to go for longer. So, what would you think about doing the actual opposite with a sandy head, of that you let the temp be a little bit higher at first and the mTOR be a little bit lower, and you ramp out that 80% of the moisture a bit faster, but then you flip it where you go lower on the shelf temp. I don't even know if there's any freeze dryers right now that are allowing the changing of the shelf temp throughout the stages, but you could at least do that with the mTOR, where you could take the mTOR, say you're running it down at 100 to remove the bulk of the moisture, but then you want to be really careful about that narrow hour window that you had mentioned before, where you can kind of go past it and over dry, of possibly extending that by increasing the mTOR.
Yeah, that maps on with what we've seen successful from a variety of different users, who honestly run both types of ramping. I've seen people successfully running where it's starting more aggressive than gentle. I've also seen it the opposite, where it starts more gentle and then gets more aggressive towards the end. I don't know that we have enough data to definitively say like which is best for which type of resin, but I do think that in general, at least like we know experimenting with that is valuable, right? So like I would encourage everybody to try both. And like um, we have some different recipes that have just been shared by users in our community, and like we're always happy to share those with people to mess with. But yeah, I mean there's logic for both, and I've seen honestly run both types of ramping run super successfully and make really good hash. So I think we need to dive deeper to test it. And you can change the shelf temps on the Holland Green Science, so you can really get super precise with like controlling your boiling points and exactly
Mm.
what heat is being applied throughout the run. So yeah, you know, again, it's like another it's another one of those things where I really don't know which is best. I think that you probably don't want to dry the whole thing at just one temp and one vacuum level like you have to on a harvest, right? There's probably some form of ramping which is best, but whether ramping up is good or ramping down is good and which is best for each type of strain, we need for sure more data before we can definitively say. But we're happy to help anybody try to get there and figure it out. So with just using even your wet weights in and your dry weights coming out, and then you know changing the recipe around, and also of course pairing it with how it comes out to you and how it smokes and all of that. I think within a few runs, you know, you can like see a noticeable difference from trying both of those.
Sure. So, let's just talk through just kind of the basics of doing a run with your software. So, and how we would incorporate that. And I'm just going to talk it through myself and then allow you to come back through and kind of correct what I didn't get right. So, if I think that I'm doing this right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure my batch ahead of time, as I usually am if I'm doing any sort of production work. When I'm doing all of my hunting and everything like that, I just go by how cleanly stuff separates. I don't really worry about the weights on it. Because you know you have to run a full bed and do your grams per square inch and all that stuff to get really accurate. So I just kind of look at clean separations. But when I'm going into a production run, so you're going to weigh your material going in, that should give you a general idea, as long as you've run that strain a decent amount, of how much hash you should be getting out of it. Then I'm going to wash it all. Um, I would think that I would probably weigh the trays themselves, maybe as I'm loading them in, because that could give me an idea of general moisture content, even though I'm trying to get it steady. If I know that I'm putting in, 5,000 grams and I'm getting 4%, then I'm getting my 200 grams back on that. So I should know about how much hash should be in there. So I'm going to weigh all of that, and then I'm going to use that against my previous data. and just look at how fast those batches were going, and get everything loaded up, and then I would go off of Ultimate Vac, and I would just open it. I would set an alarm on my phone after checking the Ultimate Vac of knowing how long it's done after that, to be more precise rather than going by the kind of automatic thing that the freeze dryer does. How did I do if I'm using your software?
Yeah, you hit it on the head for like an advanced user, I would say. What I would just add is we really try to meet you where you are at as a maker. So like if you really just are on the level of like I'm looking at my dry time and checking it at a certain time, our stuff can help you with that. If you're trying to go super advanced and figure out exactly how much moisture removing and build consistency across strains, we can also help you with that. So, it's really quite flexible. You definitely don't have to use any of the like super advanced stuff that we've talked about to get value out of it. But I think, if you're spending the money to get something like this, like you're probably a hash nerd already and like will end up going down the rabbit hole anyways. But I would say like, yeah, you got it perfectly. We have a bunch of users that come in and like, they always ask like, what's the first thing that I should do? And I always say, don't like add tons of steps to your process. Don't make it really complicated. Just look at your mTOR low point to start. Pick one thing that you want to go off of, and just try to kind of reverse engineer it, or use a shelf temp and experiment with different ones of those. But the core of it, is just like use some of the data to inform your decisions. And I know that's like a really vague call to action, but I think, again, like we really try to meet people at their ability level, and the ultimate vacuum stuff is like, to me, probably where you get the most precision right now and like the most advanced technique. But even if you just got it and you used it to see how many times you checked a batch, like that's pretty valuable. If you ask someone how many times did you check the batch for the last 10 batches, I guarantee maybe they could answer the last one, but won't be able to answer any of the other ones. And that's an important data set, So like, there's no like one right technique to use or SOP that you have to follow. You can literally just use it to see what's happening, or you can, use like the mTOR alerts that we have that will send you an alert when it hits ultimate vacuum, and some of that more complicated stuff. But I think probably the majority of the guys that are listening to this are like already somewhat data driven. If they're listening to a podcast about hash, I mean, you're pretty far down the rabbit hole. So I think most people will be used to the concept of like writing shit down and looking at it after, and that's really what we're going after. Like, we're trying to just make it incredibly simple and easy to pick whatever variable it is that you want to look at, and just record in the background, But to me, Ultimate Vacuum is probably the pinnacle. So if you work your way up to that, you can just start by looking at times and checks and seeing if you had anomalies during a run with the shelf temp. But we really like to keep it simple, and we want people to not feel overwhelmed by like this new piece of kit. Our motto is really always like, how can we design experiments and tests and stuff like that work into your existing production schedule, so that you don't have to go out of your way to do all of this complicated stuff. So there's definitely different levels to it. Um, and, starting with times, temps, that's pretty good. Then maybe getting an idea of your ultimate vacuum and the low point, next step, and then adding that in with how much water you're removing is like, how you really start to build consistency across a library of genetics.
Cool. So, let's see. I have a couple of user questions. We'll get to those. So as you said, this is kind of a very narrow niche. This podcast specifically is designed to be very technical for Generally, a little bit more in the direction of traditional market hash makers, just because we have so much more um, ability to do things as experiments, to do things, simply for quality. We don't have investors. We don't have things that we have to do in order to make bottom lines. Some of us are just going for contests and everything like that. So, I try to aim everything for what I personally would want to hear. That being said, I know you guys do offer some sort of a monthly subscription as well. Say I'm newer in hash. I just got hired, and I'm from a different industry, and I have to run a solventless lab, and I don't really know what the hell I'm doing. And I want to take some of my stuff off of my plate and everything like that. And we have a whole bunch of harvest rights or Holland Green Sciences and stuff like that. And we're just starting our hash making stuff. We bought a bunch of alleged verified cuts that are all supposed to be hashers. And for this thought experiment, let's just assume that they are of varying greases, but all stuff that wash well. So, just kind of, how would you help or approach a company like that, and what does that monthly thing kind of look like?
Yeah, so we there's also like levels to this. Like we have a pretty active Discord community, and we're constantly in there, like literally every day answering questions for people, walking them through stuff. So like if you get anything from us, whether it's a log analyzer or like one of the Hashy links, or even one for a Holland Green Science, like we're always trying to help as much as we can. We're super active in DMs. We're always happy to help. The sort of monthly packages on top of that are really, if you want to just have like absolute deep dive with me personally reviewing all of your batches and then doing like weekly or monthly calls, conducting different experiments. And we work with a variety of different ability levels. Some of the guys are like, some of the best hash makers that I've met or talked to. Other ones are, as you said, maybe someone who's in a new lab position and like knows that there's more to freeze drying than what they're currently doing. And we keep it really open ended. So like the only sort of structure we have around it is like at the cheapest monthly, I review all of your batches and we do a call every month together to go over it. I make screen recordings for you and we talk about it, and we come up with experiments together that you want to conduct. Maybe it's different shelf temps and comparing results, or seeing how different cultivars want to be tried. And then sort of everything up from there is just increasing the frequency and the like cadence of how we're meeting about it. So we do like a weekly one, which makes sense if you're running, a bit more batches, or if you're running like a bunch of new genetics that you're trying to get dialed in. And then we have like a enterprise one, which is, if you have multiple labs in multiple states and you want to get them all consistent. But the same thing sort of applies as to like what I was just saying of how, we try to meet you at any ability level. Like if you already know the basics of this and, you're not new to freeze drying, like we can immediately jump into more advanced stuff and find your ultimate vacuum and start to build out recipes specific to different strains. If you're super new, maybe we're just trying to figure out the best settings for running as much as you need to run that week to make sure that you're not running over the weekend or backlogging the freezers. So same approach where again we try to keep it super flexible, but the main value add of it is like, yeah, me and my co-founder will literally review all of your batches by hand. I'm doing the meetings with guys and going over it all together. And then, you also get access like to some of the new stuff just that we're testing and messing with. Like we have a new AI chatbot that you can just talk with about your logs, and it will give a lot of the same advice that I'm giving now, which is kind of cool. And we're always coming up with new stuff, and the monthly guys usually get to guinea pig a lot of that because we develop it to solve specific needs from them. So yeah, that's kind of the snapshot. Like, definitely not necessary to get the value out of the product. I like to think of it as like a Whoop or an Aura Ring or any of those fitness products where like you get it, and you know, if you're active about looking at it and checking it out yourself, you'll still get a ton of value out of it. The monthly is like a personal trainer on top of that. You're like opting into, you know, going a little bit deeper, having a little bit more structure, which is beneficial to people. But there's nothing that we gate behind with the monthly that you don't get if you don't, you know, opt into that. It's sort of just really us going above and beyond and almost trying to be like a personal trainer for the patches in process.
Good. Yeah. That's you know, and plenty of us that are in the hash making community are here from because we didn't do well in school, but we were smart people, or we just led a very weird life or anything like that. So, you know, some of us don't like being super analytical and data driven and stuff like that, and we're more, you know, chefs than bakers, you know. Um
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. Actually, like I think it's a lot of chefs, and that is going to change. I think the new like standard for quality is becoming increasingly more like bakers because even on the trap market, I mean, like if you're not consistently dropping fire, then you're going to fall off super quickly. It's not
yep.
even like you have to be consistent for rec, you know, which was like a lot of the initial drive for consistency. I think now even just like if your last drop wasn't as good as the one before it, like you're pretty much almost off the map. Like
Yeah.
so
I
having that
completely agree. I actually think that you have to be much more on point in the traditional than in the rec at
totally
this point. So
no, because the
those
standard is so much higher.
yeah.
Uh, exactly. So yeah, I mean, I think building consistency is really important, and thinking about it, as you said, more like a baker than a chef. You're going to start to see, unfortunately, I think a lot of the chefs lose to bakers, and like, you know, maybe the chef works more in the grow where like you're in the garden every day, you're really getting hands on with the plants, the resin, you're seeing it, you're able to make decisions on the fly. But to me, the hash making is much more baking. Like if you
Yeah.
mess up during freeze drying, that will have compounding effects that mess up during pressing, during curing. The same goes for any part in the process. The wash impacts everything downstream. The press even can go backwards and impact how stuff wants to be washed and dried. So it's like it is very much like baking. And I think that is going to be super important for all makers, not even just the large scale rec ones, but like there's a level of consistency now that's demanded from consumers that are buying rosin that like you do need to track some data to achieve. And I see all the time the guys who are just like buying shit from random farms and washing it, and it doesn't work that well anymore. Like there was a time where that was fine, and like if you had rosin, it would sell. But I think like you know it's evidenced by how makers consistently sell out some versus others. Like they are hitting that consistency. And I would venture to guess that the more consistent ones are already tracking some data. Obviously, not all of them, but they typically tend to be the ones that are like a little bit more cutting edge with the stuff they're tracking and looking at.
Yeah, and the variables in there are the input material, and the genetics just keep on getting wider, broader, and better as far as being able to get your hands on something that makes just amazing light colored, super terpy, washes well type rosin. So the you know, the beginning part of it, the artistry, the picking the plant, everything like that is becoming easier and easier. So it is going to give more credence to the baker style of we are very scientific and, you know, maximizing the potentiation of the input material versus trying to maximize the input material. Um, let's see, just a couple minutes left here. We want to get into these quick questions. One thing that I would like to put out there for anyone that's listening to this and enjoying all these things and stuff is kind of a thought experiment. I don't know if anyone has done this with you yet or not, but trying different ways of freeze drying, of ramping, of shelf temps, of everything like that, and having a dried product at the end, but then seeing how that does for room temp long term quality. um, so for me personally, one of my big things is like, I've basically to a point now where like if you can't get something that I know has been or out of the freezer for less than 48 hours total into your hands, like that, there's no way to a consumer that I want that to happen. That's I my stuff is it's either fresh press right out of the press and into the freezer, or it's hitting, just before perfectly cured, like 99.9%. And it's getting homogenized and put into a jar and then put into a freezer. So, I want that first 24 hours to hit that peak ripeness, that peak freshness, that peak everything. And so I don't have to do this thing where in the past, when I actually selected my main method was after 30 days was everything was fresh press, set out, set out at room temp at 70 degrees, and not the greatest room, didn't have the best temperature control, didn't have the best humidity. And I would dab those all throughout the month. I'd see how they all were fresh pressed and how they all were fresh cured and stuff. But at the end of the month, the jars that were still really good, those were the cultivars that I kept in my program, because I wanted something that had this amazing staying power if it wasn't kept great until it got to the end user and everything like that. And you have to be a little bit more narrow, or much more narrow, with your selections to do that versus, kind of getting everything fresh to people. But I would like to see how these different ways of possibly increasing what we like to refer to as the wetness, or the terpene retention, any of that stuff, how that affects the product long term. And just kind of see some experiments with that. So I'm sure Hashy.so could help you with that.
That's one of the big ones that we've recently started to look at because I had an experience of getting super high testing terp jar, and I mean it was just garbage. And obviously there's so many variables, but it was from a reputable maker, and it was just absolutely trash compared to jars that I had on the table that were testing lower. And I'm sure everybody's had an experience like that. So it definitely opens this concept of like a few things in my head, which is, how do different dominant terpenes or flavors or some of the other compounds influence the overall smell of the jar? And it's why I think looking at a terpene test that only has major terps doesn't necessarily represent the full picture of what's going on. But it might point you in the right direction. And then the other thing is like, how does the final moisture content of the hash influence that? Because we've definitely seen, I think a trend towards wetter rosin, as you've said. And I think that people, for that reason, are like generally very scared of over drying in the freeze dryer. But I've heard now, a couple makers, and again, like be a little wary because we don't have data or testing on it yet, say that if their jar has more residual moisture, the initial appearance is wetter, but it dries out a lot faster and then becomes crumbly and loses some of that stability. I have only seen this anecdotally from jars that I'm smoking. Again, like we don't have any data on it yet, but I think there are very few people who are, um, you know, doing what you were talking about, like taking a jar out, letting it sit there, seeing how it is after a while. And that is like the most important thing to me because I love to do the same thing, but just with other, users of ours and makers that I buy from. Like I love to get it, let it sit out and just see what happens. And it amazes me how, I mean, some of these jars in a couple weeks are 2, 3 shades darker, or some of them completely crumble out. And like, I think there's definitely stuff that you can do throughout the whole hash making process, but probably also a lot to do with how it's being dried that can influence that long term stability, as you said. And again, like anecdotally, don't have COAs on it yet. We have seen the jars, jar hash that was dried for longer result in jars that are more stable, and retain that wet consistency for longer. So that's one of the things that I'd look at. If you're trying to get dialed in, just adding on to what you said with like letting it sit and selecting off of that. See like how you dried it. Look at the freeze dryer settings and see like if you have a jar that stays wet for a super long time, did you dry that more or less than you normally dry strains? And you might find that as you dry stuff more, it results in better stability, or you might find the opposite, with your specific genetics. So I would add that in as another layer of like, see, when the ones that do really well for you, what are the characteristics? Did it stay wet? Did it retain the flavors that it had on day one? Just see also then pair it up with how you dried it. And if you have the bandwidth of resin for it, maybe even when selecting, try drying stuff different ways and see how that impacts stability. Definitely has an impact on melt stability and sort of how it creases down. So it'd be crazy to think that it didn't also influence rosin. So I think it's going to definitely be a factor with both.
So, I'll add two thoughts to that for anyone listening, as far as my personal experience goes, because I get to do a hell of a lot of R&D, and um, I think I talked about this on some previous episodes, but I have some corporate R&D experience as well, so doing things a little bit more technical. But so the two things that I would mention would be one, how I was just talking about how I don't let any of my stuff be out of a freezer for more than 48 hours before it gets into the hands of an end user. Um, that's really specific actually to the cured. The reason being is currently all of my stuff is done with contest prep style runs, where I am doing the lower temperatures. I'm doing all the things that make my hash a lot greasier and give it more terpene retention and everything like that. And what I do notice is actually a slightly quicker degradation of the product over time when I do that. I notice a higher initial end product, especially when it's cured out. It's just that beautiful consistency. The terps are a bit sharper. Everything about it is a bit better, but it does tend to darken a bit quicker that way. And depending on the terpenes, there are certain ones that can kind of change on you. So the sweet grape stuff tends to just stay kind of sweet grape. So I'm lucky on the ones that I go into personally, but especially like gassy stuff. I tend to not like gassy stuff as much. If it's that really wet stuff, I've done the contest prep and I've let it go for longer. But then on the opposite side of that would be the fresh press. So a lot of people don't like to put out fresh press because it can be a bad representation of their end product to the end user when that dries out, if it dries out. I've definitely had stuff in the past where, it's gotten that kind of like crusted over, really dry look to it as it was curing, and then you couldn't get it into any sort of a batter. It might even be actually like really crumbly in there and hard to work with and everything. But if you're doing that sort of contest prep where you're doing a little bit lower temps and being really careful with the freeze drying and the way you're washing it, and just doing everything for maximum terpene preservation, what's going to happen is you're going to have a little bit more pliable and kind of a wet, for lack of a better term, even though it's a homogenized product in your fresh press. It's not going to be that type that's a bit harder, that can act a little bit like shatter or something like that. Should be easy to get up onto a scooper. And when that cures out, that should cure out to almost like an auto jam or a very wet looking cold cure initially. So that's actually nice looking for your end user. Then they get to make it look like a nice wet batter themselves with just a couple little flicks of the wrist and a tool. So it can make it harder for distribution and getting to the end user, where you have to keep everything really cold and really nice. But it can actually extend things if you're going for the fresh press, where it might not cure out quite as quick in my experience, and when it does cure out, it's going to cure out to a much nicer product. So that person can set it out, smoke it over 2 weeks, have it cure after the first week, and then still be in that perfectly cured kind of still good thing for the following week while they're finishing that jar up and get to experience the whole plethora of what that resin can be. So some neat things there, and then let's get into the questions. So I think we've basically kind of covered everything, and this will just be a slight reiteration. Um, so does shelf temp directly affect time? We know that it does. And then what is the ideal saying for small batch versus large batch? So if you could just give a brief couple sentence idea of just what people should think about when approaching small batch versus large batch, and if they want to change any of their settings.
Yeah, that's a great one. We do an office hours every Friday, and we actually just were talking about this yesterday, so it's fresh on the mind. I would say small batch, lower temps in general, because you have more potential to over dry. It kind of goes back to the first point of like, if your patty is too thin, the edges might dry up a little bit faster than the center. So in general, the smaller the batch, the lower the temperature. If you're running really, really small batch, I would say pretty much only run 5 degrees, 10 degrees, and just wait as long as it needs to. If you're running bigger batches, it really depends on what your production schedule is. So, like, if you are running big batches but you don't have any time constraints, then maybe 4 or 5 days of drying at a super low shelf temp is fine for you. Maybe you have production constraints and you need to make sure that you're keeping up with washing, in which case going up in temperature will be super important just to turn around the batches in the speed that you need to. So small batches, I would say 5 to 15 degrees, keep it nice and low. Bigger batches, you have a little bit more room for error. So don't be afraid to go up if you need to turn stuff around faster. But it will also have to do, with the vacuum stuff, as we said. So like experiment with different ones and see what works for you. But it's pretty, it just, I would say as you go smaller, you go lower in temperature. It's a good rule of thumb.
Okay, great. And then let's see. The other one was a couple different people asked this in various forms. Sign your hash is over dried, optimal, under dried. How do you know when to stop? How do you know when it's dry? Stuff like that. So we did talk a little bit about getting hands on, seeing how it goes through the sift, everything like that. Um, so I would like your opinion on two different things. One, what are your signs that stuff is kind of over dried at the edges versus in the middle when it's drying unevenly? And two, like outside of it just being really sandy and then dry when you presses out, are there any other signs that you over dried your hash before you press it?
Yeah, there's a few like different tactics you can employ here. So the first and most obvious one that most people are doing is like if you see ice, little ice chunks or little ice flakes, um, not dry yet. It needs more time. The thing that I would add on to that is like it's pretty common to sift out the dry stuff and then only send in the icy stuff for more time, which can be effective. We see a lot of makers who are doing that and make great hash. But I would be a little bit worried if you have ice still present. To me, that would indicate that there might still be moisture throughout the batch, bound moisture in different stages. So if you're looking and you're doing a visual check for ice and maybe you're sieving some of it also to check for ice, you try both methods, see what works for you, but know that if there's ice present, that means that there's definitely still moisture there and there's probably still bound moisture throughout the batch. The next level up from that is I would say pairing some of that data, or pairing some of that, qualitative experiencing it with data either from the freeze dryer, your time at ultimate vacuum, or something like a water activity test, where you're seeing, okay, when it looks like this, when it feels like this, here's the data behind it, and you just build heuristics that way over time. Sadly, there's no like quick hack or answer, I think, at this point to know if your hash is perfectly dried right off the rip, because it really comes down also to like, just taking a little flag off of that, dabbing it, and seeing how it goes. There's certain things to
Mhm.
look for in the dab, like how it feels on the mouth, the lungs, how it melts, whether or not it sizzles. And those are all also great indicators of dryness. And using uh, when you pull your hash as an opportunity to do a little smoke test like that can never be a bad idea. But those are the main ones. I would say you have visual and physical checks, which are physically looking for ice, touching it, seeing if there's ice, and continuing. And then in terms of how to know if it's over dried and what I'm looking for there, is also kind of tricky because something can appear greasy if it's under dried or if it's over dried. If it's under dried, moisture might make it feel greasy, even though it's not, and that's actually just moisture. If it's over dried, it might start greasing together a little bit, and kind of fusing, like glassing over almost. So they're a little bit different in how they look. If it's feeling greasy but under dried, it's usually not as like glassed and conglomerated, if that makes sense. Like
Yep.
melted almost. That tends to be more a sign of the over drying. And then just like crunchiness, crispiness. If it's crunching and crispy, might be a little bit too far. If you look at even just like Instagram stories of people who are running the Holland Green Science, like it's not crispy ever usually. It's typically like free flowing, even without sieving. And that's something that you don't always see with the harvest right. Like I see a lot of guys that are pulling out batches and the tray is like pretty crispy and has to be sieved. And to me, that may indicate over dry. The final thing that you can look at, two final things you can look at is when you're pressing it, the moisture level will have an impact on your yield. And of course, there's going to be a ton of variation from different genetics and harvest times and all of that stuff. So, again, not a perfect science, but moisture level will have an impact on your yields. And you may see that as you get towards something that's like more dry, your hash to rosin yields go up. We've heard a few people talk about that. So those are all the things to look out for. And then finally is just like how it smokes, and again, not a perfect science, bit of qualitative data paired with the quantitative stuff that you can measure. But as I'm doing the final test, I'm looking for like, how does it feel? Does it feel heavy on the lungs? What's the color like? What's the flavor like? I think over dried hash has a tendency to kind of be similar flavor. Like you might be losing a lot of the volatiles that make those individual strains unique. So if it's over dried, you might find that it all just tastes kind of hashy. On the under dried side, still kind of bro sciency, but we hear a lot of people talking about how under dried stuff will be much more irritating to smoke than stuff even that's over dried. And certainly in my just like, you know, smoking different jars that were dried different ways, I've loosely noticed that map on to the point where like I can almost just look at a jar and tell whether or not it's gonna fuck my lungs up. And I know there's a lot of variables there, like what terps are present and like how many of them. So it's not all moisture, but definitely an important one to look at, and kind of goes back to what I was just saying before this of like try different dryness on the same strain. Try pushing one further than you normally would and see how it smokes. You might find that you actually prefer the one that was dried a little bit more and taken a little bit further in terms of smoothness than the one that was pulled earlier, you know? So I think like those are like probably three levels of checking for dryness versus over dried. And I'm curious also like to learn from other people what little hacks they have to check for dryness versus over drying, because we're always learning from people of ways that we didn't think about even for checking for that stuff.
Yeah, nice. Okay, let's see. Do we have anything else? Yeah. When did you just a little bit about yourself? When did you start smoking?
Yeah, I started smoking in, let's see, 2016. It was probably like my between the junior year and summer year of high school. And like kind of funny about me and strange. Like I really early on had such a negative impression of people who smoked weed at my school, and then immediately as soon as I started smoking myself, I mean, I totally fell in love with it. It became, you know, my whole thing. But I realized like a lot of what I, you know, had as preconceived notions about cannabis users were just totally incorrect. And like I was getting really good grades. I was, you know, breaking a lot of the, I guess, stereotypes that people like myself had about stoners. And I just realized, like, wow, it's such a crazy experience. Like, you literally can't tell if someone smokes weed. Like the smartest people smoke weed, and it and it defies my reality finding out this all the time. So once I
Yeah,
started,
that's
I like immediately fell in love with it, and pretty soon after that started that delivery service I mentioned, and like from that point forward had always worked in cannabis, used it all the time, and just like completely immersed myself in it.
sure. Um, and you know, you created software for Hash, and hardware. So I would imagine that that's some of your favorite stuff to smoke. But what's your favorite way to smoke? Favorite concentrate, flower, whatever. And what's your favorite device or kind of rig to use that? If it's a device, what kind of electronic one or whatever. If it's a rig, you know, maybe like your favorite artist or your favorite nail maker or something like that.
Yes, yeah. So I only smoke hash now, hash and rosin, and it's been that way for probably, I would say, at least 4 years at this point, 3 years. I smoked for a couple of years when I started, and I had the volcano, and I had all of that stuff, and then I did like a very short stint of dabbing on a traditional nail, and that was back even like just towards the tail end of where people were still seasoning nails and just literally taking it at 900 degrees. And then I stopped dabbing for a while, and when I started this delivery service, the guy I started it with had a Puffco, the original Puffco Peak, and I had their Plus way back in the day. One of the first products I got, a G Pen also. But the Peak was the first time that I was like, holy shit, this is absolutely crazy. You know, dabbing is probably the future. Like immediately we realized it, and we also at the the delivery service like pivoted to selling, you know, a lot of hash, and at that time it was mostly hydrocarbon, but like we, you know, we immediately recognized that that was going to be the future, and then I just like fell completely down the rabbit hole after that. We had e-nail setups at first, and then I started getting my own rigs. And so now I like mostly to smoke out of a rig. I have a little birch tube from a guy called Foster that I love, and as soon as I became aware of what dabbing was, I had seen his pieces, so I always wanted to own one of these, and that's what I use most of the time. I also have all of the Puffco products. I'm a huge fan of them as a, you know, fellow tech company in the hash space. I think what they're doing for hash and for cannabis in general is like it's massive. And I always think it's so funny when people get so mad about Puffco and for the culture and all of this stuff. And like they're so good for the culture. Like if you can't recognize that what they're doing is making everybody smoke more hash and buy more rosin, then I would encourage reflection on that because they're really pushing the game forward. So I have those. I have Peak Pro. I have a Pivot. I go through phases where like I like to experiment with different devices, and kind of use that. But I'm definitely daily driving a normal rig with a torch. I don't have any Cobra coils or anything like that, and a control tower. I love Highly Educated. I think also they're super cool because they're one of the few quartz companies, in my opinion, that is really focused on the tech side of things and doing cool write ups. And there's a lot of quartz companies that make amazing products, but perhaps they're more focused on the art side. Highly Educated to me is just really cool company. Have always had their stuff since I started dabbing. So their latest iterations are super cool. And then devices that I don't have, but that I've been, super impressed by. Um, the Dr. Dabber Switch 2 is mind blowing. That is, to me, a real example of where this stuff is headed. And like, just unbelievable device, incredible flavor. As a Puffco fan, like, I'll be the first to say that the Switch has much better flavor. And the experience overall is more akin to a normal dab. But I think Puffco just has the design and the form factor, and as a company, they're just killing it. So I'm super excited to see what their next iteration is. I think all of the technology is getting super close to the point where like you might not actually need torches. And we've been saying that for a long time, but like nothing has really gotten to that level yet until Switch 2, until 3D XL, some of that stuff. And then I also tried this Leadabelle box recently, which is cooling the smoke down before it gets to your mouth, and also super interesting. So yeah, no, I love to nerd out on the devices. I'm definitely still mostly daily driving torch and rig, but I love all of them. And when I go on little trips from like where I live here to my mom in Santa Barbara, I bring only the Pivot, and I'll use that for days. So I love all the devices. I'm definitely partial to Puffco, and I think that everybody's just doing super cool innovation in the space.
Cool. How's the flavor on that the cooling box thing with a dab, and also how's the harshness and the lung feel on it?
Yeah, it's super interesting. So like I will be super transparent also. I have I dab all the time for the majority of my hash consumption. I was dabbing from morning to evening. I would say 10 to 14 dabs a day. But recently, I have been trying to slow that down, just really more than anything to develop a deeper appreciation for the hash again. But also, my breathing perhaps feels slightly impacted. Like I haven't on nothing has shown up on tests or anything like that, but just cardio health I don't think is as good as it was, let's say, when I first started smoking hash. So from that lens, I'm trying to find the thing that enables me to dab like basically as many jars as I want without just feeling like I can't breathe and an elephant sitting on my chest. So that's the one knock I would give against the Pivot, is that I love it, but I feel like it really does a number on me compared to a normal rig, or at the extreme end of that, something like that Leadabelle box. The Leadabelle box is definitely cooling the smoke down when it gets to your mouth. So I found that it was less immediately irritating. The things that are interesting to consider about that though are, if you look at it, it doesn't like develop a lot of reclaim in the same way that even just a normal rig does in the water, which makes me wonder, are you getting more lipids and all of that stuff in your actual lungs? Like, is the increased efficiency good or bad? I don't really know. I did notice that, and I did a stint where I was like only dabbing on the lead bell box. I was only dabbing on the switch, only dabbing on the pivot. Um, the pivot's the worst for me, even though it's the best form factor and I love it. I think it's very cool. Irritation wise, it was the worst. I would say the Leadabelle box and a rig are really close together. The difference is not as drastic as if you're going from a pivot to the Leadabelle box, for example. But in terms of how it feels as you're using it, it definitely feels less harsh on the initial inhale. But I would have to compare it head to head with a rig, which is the only thing that I didn't really do back to back, to see over time if I felt you know better or worse breathing. But it's super interesting. I mean, I think it's interesting just from a tech standpoint too, of like no one has focused on cooling tech. Everybody's been focused on heating tech, new chambers, new ways to heat up bangers, new all of that stuff. But for the most part, it all just gets filtered through water or it's a dry pipe, and no one has messed
Yeah.
with the
You do have a couple of flower bong boys that have all the glycerin tubes that you
yeah,
throw in the freezer and stuff like
yeah,
that.
yeah.
So some low tech stuff, you know.
Yeah, no, it's interesting though. I would recommend, if you can go, like a lot of makers at Seshes will have them now. So if you can go to one of those and experience it, like I would strongly advise trying it because it's pretty interesting.
I always like trying out all the new stuff. I had a bunch of the Puffco products originally. Um, I did some filming with them recently, and I really like the guys that I did the filming with. Their ideas on the company and just everything. I can also completely understand why anyone would not care for some of Roger's opinions and be a little upset at some of the first drops of their products and the failure rates of them and such. Um, I've done the it. I can't even think of what it's called, but it's that little vial where it's like a conduction thing. Um, and it's a whole tabletop unit. They're
Oh,
like
the
six.
Indux.
Yes, yeah, the Indux.
Yeah,
So,
those look
so
super cool.
yeah, I had my own Indux unit. I've had every sort of electronic one. I've had every configuration of nail they've ever made. And for me personally, especially, I kind of beat up my lungs early. I'm a uh, I can't even think of the word. But anyways, my lungs are easily irritable, and from doing excessive amounts of washing, when me and my homie used to just run like 50, 60 cuts in a couple of days, pheno hunting everything, I messed up my lungs a bit, and they don't take things as well as they used to. I used to be able to smoke like a chimney, whatever the fuck I want. But now I have to be very careful. So I only use a certain style of bucket, and I just smoke rosin because those are the only two things that long term work for me. They gifted me one of the new 3D Puffcos when I did some filming with them, and those kind of light up my lungs a little bit. The towers and the slurpers and all those light up my lungs a little bit. If I smoke too much hash, that gets a little irritable. If I do basically anything other than rosin, and Long Island quartz is my go-to. They have thick sidewalls, a deep bucket, and no hard edges, so they're super easy to clean. You just have to have a little bit longer of a sparing cap for them. That's the only difference. But those are my go-to. So yeah, I definitely understand everybody's preferences and stuff. All right. Well, that was super informative. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about all of this data and your product. Um, and I look forward to sharing this with the community. I think they're going to find it really, really helpful.
Yeah, no, it was a lot of fun. We're always happy to help people, like I said. So we have a super active Discord community, which is very focused on like freeze drying and nerding out super deeply on hash. So it's a little bit different than some of the other Discords, I would say. Very tech forward. Everybody in there is super open to sharing. And if anybody from this listeners of this have questions, like don't hesitate to hit us up either in the Discord or on any of our social media channels. Like we just want to see everybody drying better hash. So we're always happy to help. And if you want to grab one of our devices, just hit me up and we can do like a discount for listeners of the podcast. But yeah, no, it was a lot of fun, and hopefully I
Cool.
can
And then
join
do you
again
want?
with some
And
make
then would
future.
Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. I just want to make sure. Do you want to plug your social medias and your websites and everything so people know specifically what they're looking for to find you?
Yeah, if you just Google Hashy, it'll come up. And on all social platforms, we are Hashy.so or Hashy.so on all of them. It's some variation of that. So if you just look up Hashy, usually we come up. And we have them available on our website. So yeah, you could just go on our website. We also have a bunch of articles and super deep dives into different techniques and all of that on our website. And
Is there a link for the Discord on the website?
Yes, yeah, and all of our social as well. So you know how it is with Instagram. I would encourage
Sure.
everybody to join our Discord just so that we don't have our communication channel eventually removed.
Okay. Well, I was going to put this out along with Electricity Hashco's episode where we're going to be talking about contest prep because this kind of ties into that. But this is such a good episode, and I think a standalone that I don't want people to have to kind of sift through both at the same time because they're probably going to want to jot down a lot of notes out of this and go back and reference it a lot. So it'd be kind of a lot for them to scroll through. So I think I'll leave this one as an independent episode. So yeah, man, I really appreciate you coming on and talking about all the stuff that you're doing in this space. I think it's really fucking cool.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the platform. It was really fun. I've seen you posting for a while, so it's cool to connect finally. And yeah, and hopefully I can join sometime again in the future, and we might have all new findings in tech by that point. So
Yeah, if
changes.
you ever want to come back on and bring someone or even we can talk to a couple different hash makers that are using your stuff and that are doing more of the data driven approach and just kind of hearing from them as well. That's something that we should kind of come back and revisit.
Yeah, that would be sweet. And I am excited to listen to the contest prep episode because I think that's a whole deep rabbit hole. That's a whole topic that a lot of people aren't gearing resin specifically for. So I look forward to that.
All right, brother. Well, you have yourself an awesome day.
Yes, you as well. Pleasure. Thank you.
Yep. Have a good one. Bye.